Welcome to an Archbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I'm your host, Terrence Franklin. In each episode, we go on an odyssey to discover my family history, and I invite guests to share their stories to bend the arc of history with their own legacy. You can find the show through YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Now please, join me for an Archbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I'm your host, Terry Franklin. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited today to have a guest, a very special, important guest. Areva Martin is with us. Areva is a USA Today and Wall Street Journal best-selling author, multi-award-winning Harvard-trained civil rights attorney, entrepreneur, TV and talk show radio host. She does all kinds of amazing things, and I've known her since law school and have been impressed with her since that time. So that's why I'm delighted that we were able to squeeze off a little bit of her time to come join us today. Welcome, Areva. Welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you, Terry, so much for having me.
That's really our pleasure. I know that today there's some news that's coming in. You just come over from CNN, so I was excited or anxious to hear what's going on, because I know that the news that is about to break today, even though our audience won't be seeing this for probably some months, is that Tyre Nichols, the video is about to be released. And I know you were commenting to CNN just a few minutes ago, and I wondered if you had any thoughts either in this moment or sort of looking into the future, because to me, there's so much trauma. We watch these videos over and over again, and I'm torn between whether I want to watch and be a witness to this, or whether it's better to just numb ourselves to survive.
Yeah, that's a good question, Terry. We know that Tyre Nichols' mom said that she did not watch the video, even though the police gave her, her family, and her legal counsel an opportunity to do so. She did see her son in the hospital bed with tubes and swollen eye and bloody face, but she said she didn't want to see those last minutes of her son's life. She was told that her son was calling out her name, and she said in the most profound way how hard it is for a parent to know that their child is in need and calling them, and she wasn't there. This horrific, brutal beating of Mr. Nichols occurred very close to her home, and she says she will carry that with her the rest of her days. I don't know the answer to that. I've talked to lots of psychologists about what we should do in these moments where there is these horrific videos. There was also the release of the video of Paul Pelosi, the husband of Nancy Pelosi, his attacker literally grabbing a hammer and clobbering him in the head. That video is also available now.
Shocking.
There used to be a time before social media, before this 24/7 news cycle, when those kinds of photos, there weren't there weren't many videos like that, but we weren't as a public given an opportunity to have a front row seat to witness this kind of violence. And yet here we are today. And it is not uncommon to go to your social media feed, to turn on television, and to see these kinds of very, very in real time violent videos, whether it's an attacker like the guy that's attacking Mr. Pelosi in his own home, or it's
Right.
5 police officers brutalizing a 29-year-old unarmed African-American man just yards from his mother's house. Some psychologists say this is it's become the equivalent of racial porn
Mm.
and racially trauma violence, that people shouldn't watch it because there is no benefit unless you do work like me in the news media or you have some other professional interest in it. While others say we should watch it so that we can be all the more agitated about policing in this country and all the more motivated to work to change policing in this country. So I think people have to kind of gauge what their own tolerance is for consuming this kind of violence that we're going to see and are seeing pretty regularly.
It's constant. We've just come off of two mass shootings here in California on top of this horrible tragedy, which obviously happened even before, but we're just about to see the video now. And it's all echoes of Mamie Till, and at a time, as you know, before we had the 24/7 news cycle, when what was needed was the shock so that people could understand the emotional impact of what a mother would feel to see such a thing. And as you say, Miss Nichols, I don't even know how it would deal with this, as you say, 100 yards away from where they live.
Yeah, and you're right. I'm glad you referenced Mamie Till because we know that she wanted her son to be in an open casket so that people could experience the horror. But here we are now, decades after Emmett Till is in that casket. How much more do we need to see before we are convinced that this trauma is real? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if it's something called diminishing marginal returns. You study in economics. Like
Right.
so many of these atrocities, these violent attacks, and do you become numb versus, as I said earlier, motivated to take action?
Exactly.
Does it like watching your typical drama on TV where people are getting killed left and right, and you're eating popcorn and drinking a soda, and nothing's really resonating? I'm not sure about that. I just know that I worry about this generation that's
I do.
growing up having to witness this on a real time basis. And I wonder what it does to them. Does it make them, more violent, or does it desensitize them to the horrific, atrocities that we are witnessing? I'm not sure. And maybe we won't even know, Terry, until a decade from now or 2 decades from now.
But and I guess it comes back to the question of what should we be doing? Because when this actually airs, it'll be well into the future. We'll have seen whatever the results are of the release of the videotape, and whether that's protests, violent action, what we saw after George Floyd died, and there was this moment of consciousness that I wonder was only just a moment, because we know that this has never gone away, and yet we have these systemic, woven in racism problems that even if these are black, we know these are black cops, but this is a systemic problem. Derek, I mean, what would you be doing 6 months from now to try to address this?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up because that was one of the things I just said on CNN. I've been in this seat so many times over the last decade, and each one of these incidents where there's police violence against an unarmed Black man, we say this is the one that is so horrific, that this is the one that's going to bring about real change. And then it doesn't. And you have to ask yourself, George Floyd, we saw the largest civil unrest, civil protest that we've seen in maybe ever, but definitely, since the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And we thought that that video, those 8 minutes and 46 seconds or so, while Derek Chauvin was kneeling on George Floyd's neck, we thought there was nothing that could be more inhumane.
Right.
And that if anything was going to change the way we think about policing in this country, it was going to be that video. So I asked myself, what would possess 5 Black men, mostly 30s, some even in their 20s, to engage in the conduct that we know they engaged in that caused them to be charged with second-degree murder, aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping? What was going through their minds? And did we as a society and did police officers learn nothing from George Floyd's death? And I don't know, as a society, do we have the capacity, Terry, to have, the level of civil unrest that we had after George Floyd? How many times can we do that as a nation? And to what end?
Where, how can we get to a better place? I just read Derica Purnell, another Harvard grad, who talks about becoming an abolitionist and about really looking at our systems of policing and how they are woven into and born from slave catching systems, and they're built on notions of white supremacy and even if you are Black, you are part of this systemic
Mhm.
cultural problem. And so it seems to me that we need to have some kind of true turnaround that I don't know if we have the political capacity to do anything about these things. And I worry we're still going to
Read
be
that piece. I haven't read that piece, but I'm curious. The abolitionist conversation is one that my two daughters, who are second-year law students at Columbia Law School, they're having that conversation. You know, they're 20-year-old something who have a certain view of the world. Where does our colleague end on that? Does he get to abolish the police in its entirety? That's always the issue. I spent a lot of time talking to the activists after George Floyd, a lot of the advocates, a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement activists, and some of their solutions, I just didn't know if a society, if they, if they were practical. Like one of the solutions, I talked to a young activist, she said, we'd get rid of the police, and then as a community, we would police ourselves. And I'm thinking, I don't know about my neighbors, but I don't want to be anybody's police. If you get raped or robbed, I'm not equipped to handle that.
right.
And if something happens to me, I don't know that my neighbor next door, that's an IT person or a chef or whatever my neighbor does for a living, is equipped to handle that. So that didn't seem like a practical solution. So I wonder, what does our colleagues say about where we should go in this country in terms of public safety?
I think her ultimate point of view is that we need to reframe how we think about society. And part of that is recognizing that if we didn't have the systems of oppression that are built into our society, we wouldn't need police. And how can we move at the same time, recognizing each time one of these things happens, that this is based on and an outgrowth from this system, that we also need to be looking at that at the same time. So I don't know that I think many of the people who talk about abolishing the police, similar to the rhetorical language of defund the police, I think it's a concept, it's an idea, it's a way of trying to reframe how we think about things and not simply accepting the fact that because we live in society that we will all expect to, that we need to have someone controlling us. I think the idea is that we need to begin to think at the same time while we take action, while we live our lives as human beings in the day to day. We have to, we're not going to get rid of the police tomorrow, but should the first thing that we do when we have a mental health crisis be to call the police, knowing that 911 is going to get potentially a cop who is going to take down some kid who's on the autism spectrum, who is trying to communicate with the police officer, and the officer doesn't have the humanity to understand where he's coming from. So I think it's about the philosophy of it and some small practical ideas about trying to work through it. But I do think it's aspirational more than something you can implement.
Well, like I said, my daughters in law school are having this discussion, and they say it's a regular issue that comes up, and they debate it heavily, which is what you're supposed to do in law school, right? Is to
In
have
law
these
school.
really spirited debates.
Right.
But in practice, that's where I think we need more work. We need more attention paid to, because I think many of us say, yes, this system of policing that is built on this slave narrative doesn't work.
Right.
But then when we get to what do we replace it with? Remember, there was this town, I think it was in Connecticut perhaps, or Delaware. It was a town that had disbanded their police
Right.
department and had created this public safety department. I remember interviewing some of those folks on my show, and what they told me was that basically that public safety department became a mirror image in some ways of the old police department. Different
Interesting.
people were involved, a different name was given to it, and they thought it was slightly less oppressive, but it wasn't transformative. And they
Was it
said it
New
was
Jersey, like
built up as
Camden, New
this.
Jersey or something?
Yes, it was being held up as a model for the rest of the
Mhm.
country. But when I talked to folks on the ground there, they're like, nah.
I think I remember hearing that it wasn't as successful as they thought. But I think thinking and trying different things and chipping away at it is got to help us move in something of a direction, because right now it just seems like it's so woven in. But I guess we'll all see where all this goes. But I
Yeah.
also wanted to talk to you about something else that I know you've been working on, an issue out in the desert with Palm Springs. Um, I've done some stories on um, the Bruce's Beach situation and had a nice chat with George Fothery here. But I'd love to hear some information and a little bit of the background on what's going on there.
Yeah, I am really honored and privileged to be able to represent a community of African Americans and Latinos in Palm Springs who had their homes bulldozed and burned out by the city during 1950s and 60s during what the city called its urban renewal program. And essentially, these folks lived in about 1 square mile, 646 acres in prime downtown Palm Springs. And at the time, it wasn't so prime because they lived on land that was owned by the indigenous tribe in Palm Springs, and that land had very short land leases on it, 5-year land leases. So, because of those short leases, it wasn't very attractive to developers. But because of advocacy on the parts of those who wanted those land leases to be longer so that they could be commercialized, eventually in the 50s, there were some changes to the laws that allowed those lands to have leases that were extended first to 50 years and then ultimately to 99 years. And by the time that happened, that downtown property became prime real estate. Developers wanted the city wanted it, and just about everyone wanted it because at the same time, Palm Springs is becoming this glitzy, glamorous, exotic desert getaway for the
Playground
rich
of the stars.
in Los. Yes, so from Lucille Ball to Gene Autry to Frank Sinatra, everybody had their getaway home in Palm Springs. This is also happening at the time that many Blacks are fleeing the South, trying to escape Jim Crowism, thinking that if they came west, they could find their fortune, they could, escape some of the oppressive racist policies of the South. So all of this is happening at the same time. And you have this community, predominantly Black, that can only live in this 1 square mile that became known as Section 14 because the indigenous people who owned the land were willing to rent to African Americans and Latinos who were coming into Palm Springs. Racially restrictive covenants prevented them from living near or around or in the neighborhoods of the white residents. So these are the people that were the nannies, the cooks, the chauffeurs, the builders. They were building Palm Springs. And when Palm Springs was ready to take this land and commercialize it, rather than use a legal process, rather than use a process of relocation and providing financial assistance, they just used power and might. And they went in and they bulldozed and they burned out these families. And for years, many families didn't talk about it. It upended families. They had to scatter. Most moved to the north end of Palm Springs, which was basically uninhabitable. And you can, and every horror story from there that comes with that kind of dispossession of African Americans that we've read about, that we know about, from Tulsa, Oklahoma to Rosewood, Florida, families separated, communities separated, uh, the poverty that ensues, jobs that were lost opportunities to build generational wealth, lost opportunities to home ownership. Because at the time, not only were there racially restrictive covenants in Palm Springs, you couldn't get a loan to buy a house if you were Black. You didn't have the same kind of banking relationships that your white neighbors had. So I am now representing those families who are seeking reparations. They are calling on the city of Palm Springs to acknowledge the atrocities and to make these families whole. There are probably 100 or 200 or so survivors that we've been able to identify. And then there are hundreds and hundreds, if not more, descendants of those survivors. And fortunately, 15 months ago or so, the city of Palm Springs did issue an apology. It acknowledged its wrongdoing. But then nothing happened. The case stalled for many, many months. And I got involved about 3 or 4 months ago and had a couple of goals. One was to nationalize the story because I believe that the story was so important. It should not just be a local Palm Springs story, that it deserved to be elevated to a national level. We had a big press conference several months ago, and we've since gotten a lot of national coverage, and we continue to nationalize the story. And the second thing that I wanted to do was cause the city to be willing to go beyond its apology and to move in a direction of action. And so the city did take some pretty substantial steps. It put out a request for a proposal to hire a reparations consultant. And as far as I know, that's the first city ever, in particularly this state of California, that ever has taken that kind of action. One, issue an apology, and then two, hire a reparations specialist, someone to come on, because they are acknowledging that as a city governing body, as a city attorney, they don't have the expertise to fashion a program to address the harms that have been done. I brought in Dr. Julianne Malvo, noted economist, dean at Cal State LA. She did a preliminary harms assessment and said the harm to these families could be upward of $2 billion. So we are just in this process now of creating space for the families to tell their stories, engaging our families in a way that, you know, puts them on this path to reparations. And we hope in several months or so to be sitting down with the city attorney, with this reparations specialist, to talk about what does this look like? You know, is this financial compensation to these families? Is it financial compensation plus, you know, housing grants, educational grants, home loan grants? There's so many things that we know as a society can help, never replace what's been lost. Money alone can never replace the racial trauma that these families experience, the loss of wealth, the loss of opportunities. But we are going to try our best to craft a first ever local reparations program for the families of Section 14.
That is really amazing work. I mean, as you say, we've heard these stories forever and ever, whether it's the Tulsa situations, whether it's Los Angeles making way for the 10 freeway by sweeping out Black and brown people. We see it all the time, and yet, you know, we mostly feel frustrated and like there's nothing we can do about it. You know, well, that's what happened. You know, we have to fight for changes in laws. You know, the redlining in communities and neighborhoods that created all of these and reinforced, you know, just the differences that we live in this country. But here you are doing something that is an active, positive step to try to address these harms, you know, and it sounds like it's got to go beyond just the legal, because as you say, you already made it a national question, but probably they would have had limited rights and interests as either, you know, renters, statutes of limitations, and various bars, but really causing the city of Palm Springs to recognize its sort of obligation as the government that was responsible for this activity.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Terry, because that's been a part of what I've had to do is educate the community about the limitations of the law when you're talking about a claim of this nature. And as far as I know from all the research we've done, there has not been a claim for restitution or reparations that has made its way through the court system. Our esteemed Professor Charles Ogletree went into Tulsa in the 2000s to file a claim for those survivors who had survived the burning out of, you know, what we call as Black Wall Street. And lawsuit after lawsuit filed by Charles Ogletree, who I think we would agree is one of the greatest legal minds of our era, they were dismissed. They could not make headway in the court system. There's now one case pending. Some new lawyers come along, say 10, 15 years later, and try a different angle, and they filed claims based on some public nuisance law in the state of Oklahoma, not on those federal civil rights statutes that Ogletree and his team were focused on. And most of the causes of action, most of the plaintiffs have been dismissed, and hanging on is one cause of action for public nuisance. I think there are 4 survivors. All of the descendants and all of the churches and other groups that were a part of that plaintiff class have been dismissed. So we're watching very closely what happens in Tulsa. for those 4 plaintiffs, because if that case is successful, again, not necessarily something that will set precedent across the country because it's so narrow, but it could have a significant impact as communities across this country who've had experienced something very similar think about their ability to cause governmental entities to be held accountable. So we're watching what happens in Tulsa very closely, knowing that all of these cases present incredible legal challenges because of the statutes of limitations, because of who is the appropriate
Standing.
standing jurisdiction. I mean, it's a civil procedure, law school exam for somebody to go through. And I mean, there's so many issues to overcome. And then our Supreme Court, I've been telling people, even if you are successful at the local level, that there's going to be challenge after challenge that will ultimately make its way to the Supreme Court. And I don't believe we have a court that is at all going to be receptive to any claim that a city would have to compensate survivors of, a racially motivated burning out or destruction or taking of property that happened 100 years ago. I don't see that in this court surviving, because the court knows what that would mean.
Right.
This community, Tulsa has happened all over this country. But what is encouraging is that even without lawsuits, there are universities, there are religious denominations like the Jesuits who are stepping up, saying, we don't need a lawsuit. We don't need a court telling us what to do. We know morally what our obligation is. And they are reaching out to descendants of slaves. I'm working with a group in St. Louis. The Jesuit school there, St. Louis University, identified the descendants of slaves whose labor built St. Louis University. And they are part of the same Jesuit group that is in that is the Georgetown group. So across this country, this is a movement that's no longer in the fringes. It's no longer the hippies, it's no longer the Birkenstock wearing activists. This is a mainstream movement from the federal government, HR 40, to California's Reparations Commission, to what's happening in Evanston, Illinois. It's a movement that is, I believe, the civil rights issue of our era.
It's and it's growing, and I think people were recognizing that we can't get past this past trauma unless we do make good, unless we try to transform. I'm a Buddhist, so it's about transforming that karma. I'm working with the American College of Trust and Estate Council, and there's actually a proposal for a tax reform. I think I want to call it IRC 40, as in 48% a mule, as a mechanism for reparations, and recognizing that the estate tax, which was always intended to be used as a method to redistribute wealth, is a perfect instrument to be used as a basis for reparations. So, I think part of what inspires me, and I want to thank you for bringing this up essentially by your actions, is that we as lawyers sometimes think we're limited to boxes of what we can and can't do. But you've taken your creativity and your intelligence and all of that stuff and brought forth this possibility about ways to rethink about how to bring justice and a remedy to these people in Palm Springs, which I love. And so I guess I want to leave by asking you the question that I always ask my guests, or something like it, is what would you encourage people to do to try to bend the arc of history towards justice? Because I can see that's how you live your life and conduct yourself on a day-to-day basis. But what would be your advice for others?
We live in this era, Terry, and I'm as guilty of this as the next person. And so much of it is caused by social media, all the positives of social media. Social media also has some negatives. And I think it has created, I don't know if it's created a vanity culture, but let's say it encourages vanity culture. So what I would encourage people to do is try, despite our love of our social media and our buy-in to this vanity culture, is try to put your own interest aside, even if it's once a week, once a month, once a year, and just figure out what you can do to be of service to someone else. Because I have found in my legal career, I've had ups, I've had downs, I've had incredible successes, but nothing has been more gratifying to me than when I am doing work that benefits others. So I say to people who are fortunate enough to make a lot of money, to live a luxurious lifestyle, or however you define that, just make sure that you're putting aside some time in your quest for success that is really dedicated to the service of others. And it sounds lofty. We hear Dr. King talk about it. People often quote Dr. King, but I'm a living testament to the fact that when you do something that helps other people, it is more gratifying than any check I've gotten, any case I've settled, any accolade that I've gotten. It really is, I think, what hopefully fuels most of us. And so that would be my advice. And it doesn't have to be some big grand thing. It could be a small gesture. It could be a small act. Those are equally important. So I just encourage people, figure out what you can do to be of service to others.
Service to others. That is a perfect note to end on, which I completely agree with, because that's how we connect as human beings. The best way to bend the arc of history towards justice is to know that creating a world that's better in the future means working for it today, and that means serving others. So thank you again, Areva. I really, 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 really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Have a great day.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to an Arcbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I've been your host, Terrence Franklin. You can find this show through YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.